Sergeant Craig Beattie of D Squadron, Queen's Dragoon Guards, felt the Scimitar's Jaguar engine take a shell splinter and keep running. It was the small hours of February 26, 1991, west of the Wadi al-Batin, and his four-man crew had spent the previous 90 minutes calling artillery down on Iraqi armour they were not supposed to be within 8 kilometres of. The combat vehicle reconnaissance tracked, CVRT in the ledgers at Whitehall, Scimitar to the men who lived inside it. Weighed under 8 tons, ran on aviation fuel siphoned from Chieftain refuelers, and mounted a 30mm Radan cannon that could kill a BMP at 1,500 metres. Iraqi T-55s and T-62s of the Tawakalna division could not catch it. That was the point. That had always been the point from the first sketches drawn up at the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment at Chertsey in the mid-1960s. The Ministry of Defence had wanted a reconnaissance vehicle light enough to be lifted by a Wessex helicopter, quiet enough to work forward of a Chieftain screen, and fast enough to outrun the Soviet armour it was designed to find. In the Kuwaiti desert that February, 22 years after the first Scorpion variant rolled off the Alvis line at Coventry, the design was doing precisely what it had been drawn to do, only against the wrong enemy, on the wrong continent, in a war the men who built it had never imagined. General Sir Peter de la Billière, commanding British forces in the Gulf, had watched the CVRT squadrons of the 1st Armoured Division cross the berm at dawn on February 24th, and thought, later and in print, that they were the eyes of everything behind them. Behind them sat 28,000 British soldiers, 221 Challenger 1 tanks, and a national reputation that had spent 45 years being rebuilt, one procurement decision at a time. The Scimitar was one of those decisions. So was the Scorpion that preceded it, the Fox-wheeled variant that never quite worked, and the whole doctrine of light reconnaissance that the British Army had chosen, over American objections, over Treasury complaint, over the professional preference of officers who wanted heavier armour and got aluminium instead. To understand why a scout car built for the North German plain was outrunning Iraqi armour in the Wadi al-Batin, one has to go back to a room in the old War Office building in 1958, where a committee of soldiers and civil servants was arguing about what Britain could still afford to fight, and what it could no longer afford to lose. The Suez humiliation was 2 years old. The Sandys Defence Review was on the table. And the Chieftain, the tank that would define British armour for a generation, did not yet exist on paper. What existed instead was a problem. The Soviet Union had begun fielding the T-62, the British Army of the Rhine was outnumbered 3-1 in armour, and the only serious reconnaissance vehicle in British service was the Ferret scout car, a Second World War concept in a 1950s hull. The Ferret could not kill a tank. It could barely see one before it was seen. And the men in the War Office understood, with the particular clarity that follows losing an empire in a fortnight, that the next war in Europe would be decided by who found whom first. That was the brief. The Alvis Aluminium Reconnaissance family was the answer. It took 15 years to arrive. The Alvis Works at Holyhead Road, Coventry, had been building armoured cars since the Saladin and Saracen contracts of the early 1950s, and by 1967 the company held the design authority for what the MOD catalogued as Fighting Vehicle 101, the Scorpion. Aluminium armour was the gamble. The metallurgists at Chertsey had spent 4 years testing 7,000 series aluminium alloys against Warsaw-packed anti-tank rounds, and the numbers were persuasive. For the weight of a Ferret's steel hull, aluminium could give you twice the internal volume, 3 times the range, and a road speed the Army Board recorded on the Bagshot test course in October 1969 at 82.23 kilometers per hour. That figure went into the Guinness Book of Records as the fastest production-tracked vehicle in the world. It stayed there for 2 decades. Colonel Michael Ryan, who ran the trials at the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment, told a JIC-adjacent briefing in early 1970 that the Scorpion could reach a reconnaissance objective faster than a Soviet motor rifle regiment could react to spotting it. which was the entire tactical argument for building the thing. The 76mm gun mounted on the Scorpion was a compromise, heavy enough to worry a BTR, light enough not to break the turret ring, and it drew complaint from cavalry officers who wanted something that could kill a T-64 at range. They did not get it. What they got in 1971 was the Scimitar variant. The same hull, the same Jaguar 4.2-litre petrol engine, and a 30mm Rawdon cannon developed at the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment at Fort Halstead. The Rawdon fired a discarding sabot round that could penetrate 40mm of armour at a kilometre. That was enough for a BMP-1, enough for a BTR-60, and, as it turned out, enough for anything the Iraqi army fielded that was not a main battle tank. The Household Cavalry Regiment took delivery of the first scimitars at Windsor in 1973. The Queen's Own Hussars followed. By 1975, the CVR-T family, Scorpion, Scimitar, Striker with Swingfire missiles, Spartan APC, Sultan Command Vehicle, Samaritan Ambulance, Samson Recovery, was in service across BAOR, and the reconnaissance regiments of 1st British Corps were rewriting their tactics around it. The doctrine that emerged was called in the manuals Find and Report. It was not a tank-killing doctrine. It was an intelligence doctrine. A troop of 4 scimitars working 200 metres apart across a 2-kilometre frontage was expected to locate the leading elements of a Soviet division, count vehicles, radio grid references to Corps artillery, and displace before the first Soviet counter-battery salvo landed. The vehicle's speed was not a luxury, it was the survival mechanism. Anything slower would be dead within 4 minutes of the first sighting report. The Cold War for the men in these vehicles was an accountancy problem. How many seconds between transmission and displacement? How many kilometres between observation post and rally point? How many rounds of 30mm before the Jaguar engine needed a refit? GCHQ at Cheltenham fed them signals intelligence on Soviet radio nets. The Joint Intelligence Committee in Cabinet Office assessed their reports alongside satellite photography from the Americans. What the Scimitar crews saw at first light on the inner German border went into the National Intelligence Estimate by breakfast. None of them expected to ever fire the Rawdon in anger. In August 1990, that assumption ended. The signal from Kuwait City arrived at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office overnight on August 1st to 2nd, 1990, and by dawn on the 2nd, the Joint Intelligence Committee was drafting the assessment that would go to Margaret Thatcher in Aspen, Colorado, where she was speaking at the Aspen Institute alongside President George H. W. Bush. Thatcher's account of that meeting, she published it in the Downing Street Years 3 years later, has her telling Bush that Iraq's invasion of Kuwait could not stand, and that Britain would commit forces immediately. Whether she stiffened his resolve as she claimed or whether he had already decided, as his advisers claimed, is a matter historians still divide on. What is not divided is the speed of the British response. On August 6th, the Cabinet approved the deployment of Tornado F.3 air defence fighters and Jaguar ground attack aircraft to Saudi Arabia. Operation Granby, the codename derived from the Marquis of Granby, an 18th century cavalry commander whose portrait hung in the officers' mess of the Royal Dragoon Guards. The choice was not accidental. Granby was from the beginning an armoured operation. The Chief of the Defence Staff, Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Sir David Craig, briefed Thatcher on August 10th that any serious ground contribution would require a full armoured brigade, Challenger 1 tanks, Warrior infantry fighting vehicles, and CVR-T reconnaissance. The 7th Armoured Brigade, the Desert Rats of BAOR, was warned for deployment on September 14th. The 4th Armoured Brigade followed in November, and the two together formed the 1st Armoured Division under Major General Rupert Smith. The reconnaissance element was the Queen's Dragoon Guards, the Welsh cavalry, flown out of Wattisham to Al Jubail through October and November 1990. Their scimitars and scorpions arriving by sea aboard the Row ferry Stena Inspector, and the merchantman Atlantic Conveyors replacement. The regiment landed with 48 CVR-T vehicles. 16 of them were scimitars. The rest were Scorpion, Strikers and Command variants. All of them had been drawn from BAOR stocks, vehicles built for the North German plain, painted in the green and black disruptive scheme of Central Europe, and now being repainted in the workshops at Al Jubail, in a desert sand colour the army called lightstone. Filters were fitted. Additional water containers were bolted to the hulls. The Jaguar engines, which had been designed to run on the aviation fuel available at any RAF station in Germany, were retuned for the higher octane petrol available through the American logistics chain. The Radan cannons were re-zeroed on ranges near King Khalid military city, and the crews, most of them under 25, most of them with only BAOR field training on their record, were introduced to a landscape without hedges, without villages, without the electronic clutter of Central Europe, in which a scimitar's thermal sight could see a warm engine at 4 kilometers, and its radio could transmit 200 kilometers without repeaters. General Sir Peter de la Billière, arriving in Riyadh as Commander British Forces Middle East on October 6th, wrote later that the CVR-T squadrons gave him a capability the Americans did not have: light reconnaissance that could move at 40 miles an hour across the desert, live off its own logistics for 72 hours, and report continuously by encrypted radio to Divisional HQ. 7 US Corps had M3 Bradley cavalry vehicles. Bradleys were heavier, better armed and slower. In the ground war that began at 0400 on February 24, 1991, that difference would matter. The 1st Armoured Division crossed the breach in the Iraqi berm at 1500 on February 25, 1991, 12 hours behind the American 7th Corps, moving northeast into what the operational maps codenamed Objective Copper, the first of a series of Iraqi defensive positions that ran across the western approaches to Kuwait. The Queen's Dragoon Guards led. Their scimitars, driving in a 2-squadron screen 4 kilometers ahead of the Challenger regiments, made first contact with Iraqi armor at 22:30 in a rainstorm that had grounded the American Apache helicopters and reduced visibility to under 200 meters. Sergeant Beatty's troop, moving on a compass bearing northeast at 40 kilometers an hour, identified the thermal signatures of 6 T-55s at a range of 2,800 meters. The Scimitar's SPAD thermal sight, Sight Periscopic Armored Direct, had been fitted to the CVR-T fleet in 1988 as part of a modification program costed at £14 million and pushed through the MOD by the Director Royal Armoured Corps against Treasury resistance. Without it, the Queen's Dragoon Guards would have been blind that night. With it, they had a 2-kilometer range advantage over Iraqi optics, which relied on Soviet pattern-active infrared searchlights the T-55 crews were reluctant to use because they gave away position. Beatty's troop leader, Lieutenant James Hewitt, of a squadron, later notorious for reasons unconnected to soldiering, called for artillery. 3 batteries of AS-90 self-propelled guns, working from grid references, transmitted in clear voice because the radio encryption was cycling too slowly for the tactical tempo, fired a battalion mission that destroyed 4 of the 6 T-55s within 11 minutes. The remaining 2 withdrew. The scimitars followed at distance, tracking them by thermal signature, and vectored a second artillery mission that finished them at 23:47. No British vehicle was hit. No British soldier was wounded. The action was over before the American Apache squadrons at Log Base Echo had refueled. What Beatty's troop had done in 3 hours of driving rain was the exact tactical function the CVR-T had been designed for on the North German plain 20 years earlier. Find the enemy, report the enemy, kill the enemy with heavier weapons, displace before the enemy could react. The Iraqi army dug in around static positions with limited communications and no thermal sights below battalion level, could not react. The Republican Guard divisions further north, the Tawakalna, the Medina, the Hammurabi, were better equipped with T-72s and BMP-1s, and by the morning of February 26th, the Queen's Dragoon Guards were probing towards them. The engagement at Objective Copper had established the pattern. Scimitars would find, artillery and challengers would kill, scimitars would move on. Over the next 72 hours, the Queen's Dragoon Guards fought or observed engagements at objectives zinc, platinum, lead, bronze and cobalt, the entire periodic table of British operational codenames, driving 400 kilometers across southern Iraq and into Kuwait. Not one scimitar was lost to enemy fire. 2 were destroyed by American A-10 Thunderbolt, 2 ground attack aircraft in a fratricide incident on February 26th near the Wadi al-Batin, killing 9 British soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, whose warriors were mistaken for Iraqi vehicles. That casualty count, 9 dead to friendly fire, none to Iraqi action, became the single most quoted statistic of the British ground war, and the source of a board of inquiry that ran for 11 months. The scimitar itself, the small aluminium reconnaissance vehicle designed to outrun Soviet armour on the Central Front, had done everything asked of it. What that meant for Whitehall, for the British Army and for the 40-year investment in Cold War procurement was a question that would not be answered until the accountants had finished counting. The Ministry of Defence's post-Granby cost analysis, declassified in tranches through the 2000s, and now held at the National Archives at Kew under DEFE 24 and DEFE 70, put the total British expenditure on Operation Granby at £2.5 billion. Of that, approximately £45 million was recovered from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Germany and Japan under the burden-sharing agreements negotiated by Chancellor Norman Lamont and Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd through the winter of 1990 to 91. The rest sat on the British defence budget for the following decade. What the money had bought was not simply a victory. It had bought. This was the argument made in the Statement on the Defence Estimates for 1991, presented to Parliament by Defence Secretary Tom King in July, a validation of the entire Cold War procurement architecture. Challenger 1, the tank that had performed embarrassingly in the Canadian Army trophy competitions of the 1980s and had been criticised in the House of Commons Defence Committee as undergunned and unreliable, had killed more T-72s in 90 hours of fighting than any Western tank in history. Warrior, the infantry fighting vehicle procured against Treasury objection at £1 million per hull, had crossed 400 kilometres of desert without a single mechanical loss to the 3rd Battalion, Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. And the CVR T family, Scorpion, Scimitar, Striker, Spartan, Sultan, Samaritan, Samson, had performed, in the words of the Director Royal Armoured Corps' internal report, at or above design specification in an environment for which they were not designed. That last clause mattered. The CVR-T had been drawn for damp North European farmland, with hedgerow cover and villages every 3 kilometres. It had been asked to fight in a treeless desert, where the nearest reference point might be 60 kilometres away, and where the daytime temperature reached 47 degrees Celsius. The aluminium armour, which some Whitehall critics had thought would crack in extreme heat, did not crack. The Jaguar engine, which some had thought would seize on Saudi petrol, did not seize. The thermal sights, which had been fitted in the final years of the Cold War as a hedge against Soviet night operations, worked better in the desert than they had ever worked in Germany. Field Marshal Sir Nigel Bagnall, the former Commander-in-Chief BAOR, who had done more than any other officer to modernise British armoured doctrine through the 1980s, was asked at a Royal United Services Institute lecture in November 1991 whether the Gulf War had vindicated 40 years of Cold War procurement. His answer, recorded in the RUSY Journal for that quarter, was characteristically dry. The equipment had worked, he said, because it had been designed to work against a harder enemy. The Iraqi army had never been the target. The target had been the group of Soviet forces Germany, 8 tank armies, 20 motor rifle divisions, and the operational manoeuvre group's doctrine that had haunted NATO planners since the mid-1970s. What Britain had built and what Britain had used were not the same war. but the equipment had transferred. That transfer from the deterrent role of BAOR to the expeditionary role of the Gulf was, Bagnall said, the actual dividend of the Cold War. It was not that the equipment had never fired a shot. It was that when it had finally fired, it had fired correctly. The audience at RUSI applauded politely. In Whitehall, the applause was less audible, because the same statement on the defence estimates that praised Granby also announced options for change. The defence review that would halve the British armoured presence in Germany by 1995 and disband a third of the cavalry regiments that had brought Bagnall his victory. Options for change had been briefed to Cabinet by Defence Secretary Tom King on July 25, 1990, 8 days before the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, 6 months before the ground war, and 18 months before the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union. The paper was one of the first serious peace dividend calculations produced anywhere in NATO, and it was drafted by a Whitehall assumption Prime Minister John Major inherited from Thatcher, that the Cold War had ended in November 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, that the Soviet threat to Western Europe was terminal, and that Britain could safely reduce its regular army from 155,000 to 116,000 within 4 years. The Queen's Dragoon Guards, whose scimitars had led the 1st Armoured Division across the Berm, were not disbanded. They were re-rolled and rebased. The 17th/21st Lancers and the 16th/5th Queen's Royal Lancers, both CVR-T-equipped BAOR reconnaissance regiments, were amalgamated in 1993 into the Queen's Royal Lancers, the 4th/7th Royal Dragoon Guards, and 5th Inniskilling Dragoon. Guards were amalgamated the same year into the Royal Dragoon Guards, the 13th/18th Royal Hussars and the 15th/19th. The King's Royal Hussars were amalgamated into the Light Dragoons. 9 cavalry regiments became 5. The reconnaissance capability of the British Army, which had grown steadily from the introduction of the Scorpion in 1972 to the modification programs of the late 1980s, contracted by roughly 40% between 1991 and 1996. The scimitars stayed in service, the regiments that had operated them did not. What drove the reduction was not the performance of the equipment in the Gulf. It was the Treasury's calculation that the British Army of the Rhine, 55,000 troops stationed in Germany under the terms of the 1954 Paris Agreements, was no longer necessary in a Europe without a Warsaw Pact. The last Soviet tank had crossed the Elbe eastward in June 1991. The last group of Soviet forces Germany units withdrew from the former East German territory in August 1994. And BAOR, which had existed since the Attlee government committed British forces to the defence of the North German Plain in 1949, was renamed British Forces Germany in October 1994 and reduced to a garrison. The historian Peter Hennessy, writing in The Secret State a decade later, argued that the transition from Cold War to expeditionary posture was managed with more competence in London than in Washington or Paris, because Whitehall had spent the 1980s under Thatcher rehearsing the arguments for a smaller, more mobile, more deployable army. Hennessy's evidence is the Nott Review of 1981, which had proposed reducing the Royal Navy's surface fleet in favour of the strategic deterrent, and had been fought to a compromise by the first Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Henry Leach, the same Leach who, 3 months later, had persuaded Thatcher that the task force could reach the Falklands. Options for change was in Hennessy's reading the Nott Review completed. It was the moment Whitehall admitted that the Cold War army had been designed for a war that would never be fought, and that the equipment which had been built for that war would spend the next 20 years fighting different ones. The scimitar was one of those pieces of equipment. Between 1991 and 2015, it served in Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, twice, Afghanistan, and Sierra Leone. It was finally withdrawn from frontline British service in the late 2010s, replaced by the Ajax programme, itself the subject of a Public Accounts Committee inquiry into cost overruns. Sergeant Craig Beattie's scimitar, the one that had taken a shell splinter in the Jaguar engine, on February 26, 1991, was recovered by Sampson armoured recovery vehicles the following morning and returned to the Queen's Dragoon Guard's vehicle park at Al Jubail on March 3rd. The engine was replaced in field workshops. The hull was inspected for cracks, and the vehicle was shipped back to BAOR aboard the merchant vessel Anvil Point. It re-entered service with a squadron at Wolfenbüttel in June 1991. 2 years later, in the amalgamations of 1993, that scimitar was reallocated to the newly formed Queen's Royal Lancers, painted in Central European scheme once more, and driven on exercise across the Soltau training area, the same North German heathland where CVR-T crews had practiced find and report against a hypothetical Soviet enemy for 2 decades. There was no Soviet enemy on the Soltau in 1993. There were German civilians complaining about noise, environmental protesters objecting to tracked vehicles on protected ground, and a Chancellor of the Exchequer in London calculating how quickly the BAOR estates could be sold to raise capital for the domestic budget. The Cold War, for the men who had fought and not fought it, ended in a way that historians have not agreed a shape for. Christopher Andrew, whose The Defence of the Realm, the Authorized Centenary History of MI5, appeared in 2009, argued that the intelligence war continued through the 1990s, with only the enemies changing. Lawrence Freedman, in The Official History of the Falklands Campaign and later work, has emphasized that British strategic culture between 1945 and 1991 was defined less by anti-Soviet posture than by the search for a post-imperial role that would preserve British influence at acceptable cost. Peter Hennessy has argued that the Cold War was, for Britain, primarily a domestic story. A story of how the Attlee welfare settlement, the nuclear deterrent, and the transatlantic alliance held together for 45 years against the internal pressures of decolonization, industrial decline, and repeated sterling crises. All 3 historians agree on one specific claim: the equipment that Britain built between 1945 and 1991. The V-bombers, the Chieftains, the Polaris submarines, the Cheveline warheads, the Nimrods and the Buccaneers and the CVR-T family was built to deter a war that never came. And the fact that the war never came is the measure of whether the equipment worked. The scimitar did not stop the Third Shock Army from crossing the Elbe. Nothing did. Nothing needed to. The Third Shock Army stayed where it was, and the scimitar sat in its hide at Bergen-Hohne, and the Jaguar engines were turned over once a week to keep the seals soft, and the Radan cannons were cleaned and re-zeroed and never fired at a Soviet vehicle. That is what deterrence looks like from the inside. It looks like 40 years of not firing. When the scimitar did finally fire in the Wadi al-Batin on the night of February 25th to 26th, 1991, it was firing at an enemy the Chertsey engineers had never planned for, with a weapon that outranged Iraqi optics because it had been designed to fight in the dark against Soviet armor. The transfer was accidental. The competence was not. Field Marshal Lord Bramall, Chief of the Defence Staff from 1982 to 1985, was asked in a 2001 interview held in the Imperial War Museum's Sound Archive collection what he considered the most important single decision of British Cold War procurement. His answer was not the Polaris Agreement of December 1962, though he acknowledged its strategic weight. It was not the Chieftain, which he had commanded as a young officer, and had watched break down repeatedly on BAOR exercises through the 1970s. It was the decision taken in the mid-1960s and defended against Treasury objection through 3 defence reviews to build a family of light aluminium reconnaissance vehicles that no other NATO army procured in comparable numbers. The Americans had wheeled cavalry. The Germans had the Luchs. The French had the AMX-10RC. None of them chose the light tracked approach the British chose. Bramall's argument was that reconnaissance had always been the British Army's comparative advantage, a legacy of colonial policing, of the cavalry tradition, of an officer corps trained to operate in small units at distance from higher command, and that the CVR-T had preserved that advantage into an era when heavier armour and longer-range artillery threatened to make traditional reconnaissance obsolete. Whether Bramall was right is contested. The military historian John Keegan, reviewing British Cold War procurement in the 1990s, argued that the CVRT had been over-specialized for a European battlefield that never appeared, and that the Warrior IFV and Challenger tank had done more to establish British armoured credibility in the Gulf. The counter-argument, made by officers of the reconnaissance regiments themselves and preserved in the regimental archives at Cardiff Castle and the Household Cavalry Museum at Horse Guards, is that the Warriors and Challengers could not have moved without a screen ahead of them. And the screen, in every action of Operation Granby's ground phase, was CVRT. The truth is probably in both accounts. Britain's Cold War, from Attlee's decision to build a British atomic bomb in January 1947 to Major's options for change announcement in July 1990, was a series of procurement gambles taken by a country whose economy was smaller than its ambitions and whose ambitions were larger than its allies expected. Some of those gambles failed. TSR-2 was cancelled in 1965. Blue Streak was cancelled in 1960. Skybolt was cancelled by the Americans in 1962, forcing the emergency Nassau meeting between Macmillan and Kennedy that produced Polaris. Nimrod AEW.3 consumed £900 million and was abandoned in 1986. The record is not a series of triumphs, it is a series of expensive lessons in what a middle-ranking power can and cannot afford to build. The CVR-T was one of the successes. It came in at reasonable cost. The total Alvis production run from 1972 to 1994 was approximately 3,500 vehicles at an average unit cost, adjusted for inflation, of under £500,000. And it did what it was designed to do. It also did what it had never been designed to do, in a desert its designers had never contemplated, against an enemy its doctrine had never studied. That is the accidental legacy of 45 years of British Cold War procurement. Not the wars that were fought, the wars that were prepared for, that were rehearsed and equipped and financed and never fought, and the equipment that was left over when the preparation ended. The scimitar in Beattie's troop, the one Iraqi armour could not catch, was a Cold War vehicle in a post-Cold War fight. It was the last thing British reconnaissance did before the Cold War army was disbanded around it.